Join me in Hebrews chapter 11 this morning. Actually, if you'd like to do this, go to Hebrews chapter 11, but then also turn to Genesis chapter 12 and kind of keep your finger there or bookmark that in some way, because we're going to kind of go back and forth between Hebrews 11 and Genesis 12. I want to begin a new series of messages entitled The Great Adventure. And this morning we're going to look at the life of Abraham. And I kind of wanted to preach through this series of messages. A few weeks ago I was thinking about the Stephen Curtis Chapman song, which was put out in 1992, entitled The Great Adventure. And the chorus of that song goes like this: "Saddle up your horses, we've got a trail to blaze, through the wild blue yonder of God's amazing grace. Let's follow our leader into the glorious unknown. This is the life like no other. This is the great adventure." And so as I was thinking about that song, I was thinking how the Christian life really is an adventure. You know, some people look at the Christian life and they think being a Christian means you have to give up a life of fun, right? You have to give up a life of excitement in order to come and sit in a church service every week. This morning for us, I want us to see that if church is boring, if the Christian life is boring to you, it isn't God's fault. Think about Jesus' life here on earth, right? It was anything but boring. Being a disciple may have been a lot of things, but it was certainly never boring. Just think about all the places you would have gone had you been one of those first disciples of Jesus. Jesus got himself kicked out of his own hometown. How's that for adventure for you? And almost killed in the process. He tore up the temple with all of its money changers. In the middle of a raging storm out on the Sea of Galilee, in a little fishing boat, he falls asleep while his disciples are panicking. Now that's adventure, right? They're scared out of their minds. And finally, Jesus calms the storm. Jesus went to lepers, even touched them. The outcast. He ate with the tax collectors. He spent time with the poor. The call to follow Christ, the call of faith, was a call to a life of adventure. And it's still the same today. I don't think that we typically think of faith in those terms, at least not very often. But the Bible certainly does. Way before Captain Jack Sparrow, way before Indiana Jones, way before Roy Rogers or John Wayne, way before the great adventures that little boys dream of, we have the accounts of real life adventures that are found in the pages of the Bible. And so for the next few weeks, I want us to take a look at some of these real life adventures. Not as some larger than life, extraordinary superhero type adventure, but rather as the Bible presents them, as ordinary, real people who God calls to a great adventure. I believe that God calls each one of us to a great adventure of faith. So let's look at Hebrews chapter 11. And let's think back about the story of Abraham. In Hebrews chapter 11, we see this in verse 8. 8 says, "By faith Abraham, when he was called, obeyed by going out to a place which he was to receive for an inheritance, and he went out not knowing where he was going." The first thing we see here is a faith-filled risk. The writer of Hebrews here is just kind of summarizing this great story of Abraham. If you go back to Genesis chapter 12, all right, let's go back there to Genesis chapter 12. And here we're first introduced to Abraham. And we find out that he's 75 years old. And God calls him to this great adventure. Let's read there in Genesis chapter 12, beginning in verse 1. Now the Lord... I'm sorry, I'm in Exodus. I need to be in Genesis. I'll get there. Genesis chapter 12. Here we go. In verse 1. Now the Lord said to Abram, "Go forth from your country, and from your relatives, and from your father's house, to a land which I will show you. And I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you, and I will make your name great, and so you shall be a blessing. And I will bless those who bless you, and the ones who curse you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth will be blessed." So Abraham went forth as the Lord had spoken to him, and Lot went with him. Now Abraham was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. So God tells Abraham, "Go. Go and leave all that you know behind." And he doesn't even tell him where he's going. He says, "Go to a place that I will show you." In other words, get started on your journey, Abraham, and I'll show you where you're supposed to go. I'm not going to tell you right now. Just take the first step. This is a faith-filled risk. What kind of challenge would that have been for Abraham? How ready do you think he was to just pick up and move? Or how set in his ways do you think he might have been? No, I'm not 75 years old, but I hope to be someday. I know that some of you here are in your 70s, some in your 80s, right around the age Abraham was. Let's be honest. Change is not something that usually comes very easy at that age. The truth is, for some folks, change doesn't come easy at any age. But even more so the older you get. But the key to all of this is found back in Hebrews chapter 11. So let's go back there again. Hebrews chapter 11. And here's the key. It's found in verse 8 when he says, "By faith, Abraham, when he was called, obeyed by going out." Abraham obeyed and he went. That's the key, really. He obeyed and went. And there doesn't really seem to be any discussion about it. Even as you read the account in Genesis chapter 12, there's no real discussion about it. He just packed up and left. There's none of this, God, let's think about this for a minute here. I'm really too old for any of this, right? You want me to just pick up and move? What you need to do, God, is you need to find one of those young folks out there that have more energy than me and just, pick them. After all, they're the future anyway, right? I've done my part, God. Now it's their turn. But we don't see that happening here in Scripture. Abraham obeyed and he went. I know some who've actually said those types of things before. I've had conversations with folks who have said, I've done my part, now it's someone else's turn. The next time you think about saying something like that, think of Abraham 75 years old, and God calls him to a great adventure. And it starts by packing up and moving, making one of the biggest changes in his life that he could make. 75 years old. The next time you're tempted to say, I'm too old, or I've done my part, or God, you need to choose someone else, you think of Abraham. But, that would be our natural response, right? It's not, this isn't for me. This isn't, this isn't what I'm used to, or I'm too old, or I've had my time already. That's our natural response. But Abraham, he faithfully obeys and he goes, even though he has no idea where he is going at the time. He didn't know what the outcome was going to be. He wasn't given a roadmap with all of the stops clearly marked. I wonder if he had been given all of the stops and steps along the way. I wonder if God told him, if God would have told him, Abraham, here's what we're going to do. We're going to go this far, and we're going to stop here, and these are the events that are going to take place, and this is what's going to happen in your life, and then you're going to move from here to here to here. I wonder if he had known all of that in the beginning, what he would have done. If you know the story of Abraham, and you know the life that he lived, and you know all the different twists and turns that his life took, how many of us would have said, sure, I'm up for the job? If he had known what was fully in store for him, I wonder what he would have said. But the Bible just says he obeyed and went. He obeyed and went because God said that's what he needed to do. And when he got to where he was going, what happened? Well, Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 9 gives us that answer. It says, by faith he lived as an alien in the land of promise, as in a foreign land, dwelling in tents with Isaac and Jacob, fellow heirs of the same promise. What happened when he got there? He made his home in a foreign land. That's total commitment. That's total commitment. He made his home in a foreign land, a strange land. He lived as a stranger, as a foreigner, as an alien, it says, in this country. Let me ask you, have you ever ended up somewhere that you never, in your wildest dreams, thought you would be? I don't mean you got lost. I mean, you ended up somewhere you never even dreamed of, but you were exactly where God wanted you to be. Has that ever happened to you? When you answer God's call, when you say yes to the great adventure that God has for you, there's no telling where you just might end up. Genesis also tells us that when Abraham left Haran, he took everything with him. If we go back there to Genesis chapter 12 real quick, kind of keep your finger there in Hebrews 11 because we're going to come right back to it. But Genesis chapter 12 and verse 5, it says, Abraham took Sarah his wife and Lot his nephew and all his possessions which he had accumulated and the persons which he had acquired in Haran, and they set out for the land of Canaan. Thus they came to the land of Canaan. What does Abraham do? He takes everything with him. Why didn't he just pack an overnight bag? Right? Why did he have to take everything with him? Answer: because he wasn't coming back. He wasn't coming back. There was no plan B. There's no backup plan. Nowhere does he say, okay, God, we'll kind of take this for a test drive here. I'll give it 6 months and we'll see what happens. If it doesn't work out, I can always come back home. But it doesn't say that. When he left, he left. He had no intention of coming back. He took everything with him. That's faith. Let me ask you, how many one-way tickets have you purchased? How many times have you completely put yourself in God's hands and said, God, I'm ready to commit to this, and there's no going back. I'm all in. I've packed up everything. I'm not coming back. You know, God is not looking for us to take His plan for a test drive. He wants us to go all in and trust Him. Taking up the call of God requires total commitment. Are you ready? Total commitment. And there should be no idea of going back. Abraham didn't. And when he got to the promised land, what does he find? Nice, friendly neighbors like him and his family, right? Folks you would invite over for a backyard barbecue? Nope. Nope, he found the Canaanites. And guess what the Canaanites were like? They were heathens. They weren't the kind of people he was used to being around. They didn't look the same. They didn't eat the same kind of food. They didn't wear the same kind of clothes. They didn't listen to the same kind of music. Their skin was a different shade. Their culture was so completely different than the culture Abraham knew. Even their values were different. They didn't share the same respect for human life, and they worshipped idols. And here, Abraham makes his home among them. He's living as a stranger in this foreign land. But it was here that God instructed him to go. You know, God will call us to some great adventures in the Christian life. He'll call us to go to places we never dreamed of going. He'll call us to get involved in ministries we never thought we could ever be involved in. And He'll call us to associate people, and we'll do things, and we'll be involved in events, and sometimes we just kind of scratch our heads and say, God, are you sure? Yeah, He's sure. He's called you to it. It's where He wants you to be. God called Jonah to go to Nineveh. Nobody liked Nineveh. You think the Canaanites were bad? Abraham ought to be glad he wasn't Jonah, having to go to Nineveh. But that's a message for another time. The adventure of Abraham goes on. All right? There's this faith-filled risk. He obeys and he goes. There's that total commitment. He packs up everything and settles in, makes his home in a foreign land. But the adventure goes on. Hebrews 11, verse 11. By faith, even Sarah herself received ability to conceive, even beyond the proper time of life, since she considered him faithful who had promised. Therefore, there was born even of one man, and him as good as dead, at that, as many descendants as the stars of the heavens in number, and innumerable as the sand which is by the seashore. Here we see a surprising promise. A surprising promise. Abraham and Sarah receive a promise from the Lord that they are going to have a son. And Sarah hasn't been able to have children all of this time. And now she's well beyond the age of having children. And God says, you're going to have a son. And Abraham is getting up there in age as well. And God says, you're going to have a son. And not only are you going to have a son, God says, but your descendants are going to be so many that you're not even going to count them all. That's how many. A surprising promise. You know, life is full of surprises, isn't it? How do you think this one went over with Abraham and Sarah? Oh, they wanted children. They had for years. But don't you think they had probably given up at this point? I do. If you don't think that having children changes your life, let me just tell you something. It changes everything. Having children is wonderful, but it changes everything. It really does. And here, Abraham and Sarah, they're pushing 100 by the time their son is born. Talk about an adventure. They're about to have the adventure of their life. Tell me that God doesn't have a sense of humor when he says to Abraham and Sarah, you're going to have a son. When God called Abraham, he called him to a great adventure of faith, beyond anything that he could imagine. And is that any different with us? Doesn't God still call his people to great adventures? Is Abraham really any different from us? Abraham would certainly go on and become the father of Israel, the great patriarch through whom God would form his chosen people. But the Bible is pretty honest about his failings as well. On more than one occasion, he lies to Pharaoh. At one point, he and Sarah try to bypass God's plan for their children by having a son with Sarah's maidservant, Hagar, which, by the way, creates all kinds of problems and dysfunction in that family down the road. In fact, the problems that we have today in the Middle East go all the way back to the problems between Ishmael, Abraham's son through Hagar, and Isaac, Abraham's son through Sarah. Just picture that, if you will. Abraham doesn't obey God. He takes matters into his own hands, if you will, and he says, God, Sarah's never going to get pregnant. She's never going to have a baby. So I'll have a baby with Hagar, and we'll get this promise going. You see what happens when you mess with God's way of doing things? But God still used Abraham. God still used Abraham in great ways. And he still blessed Abraham, and he still had a great plan for Abraham's life. And none of us, you and I, none of us are perfect either, but God can still use each and every one of us as well. And so if church is boring, if the Christian life is boring, and I really hope that it isn't for you, but if it is, it isn't God's fault. It's our own fault. Maybe we've distorted our view of what the church and Christianity ought to look like. Maybe we don't fully grasp what God has called us to do. This morning, I want to suggest to you that God has called you into his glorious kingdom. And it's to a life of challenge, certainly, but it's also excitement, sometimes surprises, and certainly adventure. Jesus said in John 10:10, the thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. I came that they may have life and have it abundantly. What is your life like this morning? I realize we aren't all called to go to Africa or some other part of the world. We're not even all called to do some sort of short-term mission work. And we're not all called to be pastors either. But neither are we called just to come and fill a chair on Sunday mornings. No matter how young you are or how old you are, no matter what you've done in your life, God has a great plan for you. And it doesn't involve just sitting in a chair for 1 hour on Sunday mornings. There's too much God wants us to do right here, right now. It starts in our own homes. It starts with our neighborhoods and our communities. And what a great adventure it really is if we just trust God and obey and follow Him. If you haven't accepted the invitation that God has given, this invitation to this glory, into His glorious kingdom, into a life of excitement and adventure and sometimes challenge and surprise, if you haven't accepted that invitation by walking away from your sins and receiving forgiveness, now's the time to make that commitment. But if you have made that commitment already, and somehow you're just kind of bored in your Christian walk, I challenge you, ask yourself this question: why? Why do I feel this way? Because it's not God's fault. If you'll just ask Him to show you and lead you, there's no telling where He might take you and what He might have for you. And just get ready, because God has big plans for you. It's time you ask Him what adventure He's got in store for you. God bless you.